Hey guys, in this lesson, I want to talk about something that you might have come across or will come across at some point in your React development journey. And it's this comparison between hooks and classes. Now, in order to really understand this, we have to go back and go to the very beginning. And so, once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there were two ways of adding state into a React app. One way, or what you might call functional components, look like this, and you should be pretty familiar with this by now, and it's a really well understood way of creating these separate React components. But you should be aware that there's also another way that you can, in fact, create React components. Instead of splitting individual components into functions, you can also create a class. And the only difference is the keyword instead of function becomes class. Classes are not called, so they don't have these parentheses. And this class must extend something that comes from the React module, something called component. And this turns your app class into a React component class. And in order to render what you want to see inside this component, you have to add your code inside a render method, like so. That wasn't a big deal, and it was just a few extra lines of code, and we end up with exactly the same result. Now, in the past, the main reason why people converted their functional components into class components was because it was required in order to have state. If you take a look at some of the documentation on state and lifecycle, for example, which I'll link to, you'll see that in order to use state, it used to be that you had to convert your functions into a class, just like what we did just now. So what does managing state using classes actually look like? Let me show you a simple counter app as an example. And so I've created a class component here of our counter app, and all it does is it has a single button which increases the number of the count. So if I go ahead and replace my h1 with my class component, you can see that I'm using it in the same way as I would with my functional component, just adding it in as a self-closing tag. Now, using this class component, I'm able to render a h1 and a button, and when this button gets clicked, it calls a function called increase. An increase will then in turn call a pre-built function called setState, which allows us to pass over some new values to the object that is stored inside this property state. Now, this works exactly the same as what we would have done using hooks, but you can see that it involves a lot more boilerplate code, and it's a little bit harder to reason about, especially when you've got this all over the place. It also requires binding, and it gets pretty complicated when you want to reuse some of your state functionality across different components. So back in 2018, the React team set about trying to solve this problem and many others, and they came up with the idea of hooks. And I strongly recommend to actually have a look at this page in the React documentation, just so that you can watch the video and take a look at some of their concepts around why they decided to build hooks and why it's so awesome. Now, what the React team recommends is that if you're writing new code, that you should start using hooks instead of classes, because this is a much easier way of managing state. It just makes the code much clearer and much easier to reason about. Now, the thing to remember is that you can only use hooks with functional components. You can't use it inside a class component. But they do say that if you already have classes written for a React app, then you can use it alongside. Here, I've written the functional component equivalent of our counter app here. And you can see that at a glance, firstly, by using hooks, we're saving ourselves a lot of lines of code. And this is because it removes a lot of the boilerplate that's required in order to use classes. You'll see that there's no this keyword all over the place. You can see that the state is kept together in one constant, and you've got the count and set count being destructured from our useState function. And all we have to do to change the count is to call set count. If we want to use the count, then we simply use it as the variable name itself. So this way, we can create React apps that are entirely built using functional components instead of having a mix of functional components and then occasionally having to convert our functional components into class components just to be able to have a stateful app. But in the wild, you will occasionally see components built using classes. You will see this .state or .setState. But gradually what we're seeing is that the React community is really embracing this concept of hooks, and new code and future code will be written in this format. So this is just a quick lesson to talk about these two different ways of managing state, just so that when you come across classes in the wild, you're not confused about what's happening. Most of the cases when people are telling you to write class components, it's to be able to use and set the state of an app, which you can achieve in exactly the same way using this useState hook.